Anybody? We've got a couple up here. Anybody else? So one of my most encouraging people, Jim, back in the corner said, wow, we might be here till 9 o'clock. I promise we won't be here that long. We do have a really long selection today. We are getting very, very close to ending Judges, and we've been studying this for, I believe, almost a year. How many of you have really enjoyed our study of Judges? I have to admit that when we first started it, I thought, this is going to be a lot of battle type stuff, and I don't necessarily get into that. That's not my gig, but I have really enjoyed it. It's been very rich. And I think that one of the things that has been most interesting to me is it's a lot of an example of what you probably shouldn't do. And today's is a really great example of that. In the last few weeks, we've been studying specifically Israel's battle with their brothers in the tribe of Benjamin. The warring started because of the terrible, violent murder of a concubine of a Levite. And this is probably, in my opinion, one of the worst stories in the Bible, besides Jesus' crucifixion. 2 battles up to right now have already taken place, and we're going to talk about the third one today. And so far, the Benjamites have won the first 2 battles. And when we left off last week, the Israelites were broken before the Lord. They were weeping, fasting, offering burnt offerings. And they were inquiring of the Lord if they should go to battle against their brothers again or if they should not. They at least were inquiring of the Lord at this point rather than just going off on their own. This time the Lord told them to go to battle and he would provide victory. So we're picking up, and on your handout, it left off the chapter, so it should say Judges 20, verses 29 through 48. So you can write that in there. So we'll read through this first. Bear with me. So Israel set men in ambush around Gibeah. And the people of Israel went up against the people of Benjamin on the 3rd day and set themselves in array against Gibeah at other times. And the people of Benjamin went out against the people and were drawn away from the city. That's important. And as at other times, they began to strike and kill some of the people on the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel and the other to Gibeah, and in the open country about 30 men of Israel. And the people of Benjamin said, they are routed before us as at the first. So they're a little cocky. But the people of Israel said, let us flee and draw them away from the city to the highways. And all the men of Israel rose up out of their place and set themselves in array at Baal Tamar. And the men of Israel who were in ambush rushed out of their place from Mer Geba. And there came against Gibeah 10,000 chosen men out of all Israel. And the battle was hard, but the Benjamites did not know that disaster was close upon them. So up until this point, the Benjamites are thinking, yeah, this is in the bag. We've got this. We beat them twice already. We're going to do it again. And the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the people of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day. All these were men who drew the sword. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin because they trusted the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. Then the men in ambush hurried and rushed against Gibeah. The men in ambush moved out and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. Now the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men in the main ambush was that when they made a great cloud of smoke rise up out of the city, the men of Israel should turn in battle. Now Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. They said, surely they are defeated before us as in the first battle. But when the signal began to rise out of the city in a column of smoke, the Benjamites looked back behind them, and behold, the whole city went up in smoke to heaven. Does that make you think of any other burning city in the Old Testament? Any thoughts? Sodom and Gomorrah? Yeah, there's a correlation there. Then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were dismayed, for they saw that disaster was close upon them. Therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness, but the battle overtook them. And those who came out of the cities were destroying them in their midst. Surrounding the Benjamites, they pursued them and trod them down, as far as opposite Gibeah on the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them men of valor. And they turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon. 5,000 men of them were cut down in the highways, and they were pursued hard to get them, and 2,000 men of them were struck down. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of them men of valor. But 600 men, so that's all that's left over, 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and remained at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. And the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men and beasts, and all that they found. And all the towns that they found were set on fire. So they go from 25,000 to 600. Now, two things are really clear at this part of the narrative. One of them is the tribe of Benjamin was really overconfident. And overconfidence going into battle is not usually a great thing. Israel acted just on the accusation of another brother within the congregation. So you may remember that the Levite whose concubine was killed comes and tells them what has happened. The Benjamites don't come to the meeting. They don't try to explain to them what's happened. They don't try to give over the people who did it. They just prepare for war. And because they're not there, Benjamin kind of feels like, well, we're just going to go to war. We have the better warriors, and so we're going to just go and fight them. And they feel like they're justified in doing that because no one even tried to check with them and see what had happened. But they really should have at least gone to the meeting and tried to explain their side, but they just decided to prepare for war. They knew that Israel had fewer warriors, so they think, well, if we can obviously beat them, we're better than them. And they were better prepared. Remember Lance talking about how they had all the left-handed soldiers, and so they could actually easily defeat them because of the way they could fight. They could get to the side of them that was not protected by their armor. And Israel had already lost to them twice. So they go into this thinking this is going to be a piece of cake. The other thing that I think is really evident, and I think it's very important for us to remember as we're looking at conflicts that we may face, is that neither party goes into this thinking, oh, these are our brothers. We really should leave room for reconciliation. And as Christians, isn't that something that we should always have in mind? So reconciliation is not going to be an option. Israel has drawn Benjamin out of the city. Remember, they're feeling overconfident, so they think, oh, we can go out in the city, out in the middle of nowhere. We can be exposed because we're stronger than them. We have more people than them. They really can't hurt us. And so they're heading into an ambush. They're heading into a trap. So they kill 94% of Benjamin. Once they've killed that many people, they leave 600 people left. There's really not a chance for them to go and now say, oh, we would really like to reconcile now that we've killed most of you. And then Benjamin is their brother. Now, can you imagine? It's one thing if they were an enemy of them, but they have gone and treated their brother this way. They're part of the tribe of Israel. And they have responded to them in a way that they would respond to a mortal enemy. Going to them now and trying to reconcile with them would be very, very difficult. If you recall, at the very beginning of Judges, it starts out with war, but it's war against the Canaanites. God tells them, get rid of these people. Do they get rid of them? Not completely. And so they've been putting up with the Canaanites living amongst them for years. Actually, they've started to adopt some of their vile practices. They've been okay with that, but now one of their brother tribes does something that's pretty vile. And immediately they want to get rid of all of them. So they've put up with their enemies living amongst them. They've put up with the evil practices that they have, and they haven't done anything about it when God told them to. But their brother does something, and immediately it's like, let's get rid of them. We're sending them to exile. So they've treated, and Lance mentioned this last week too, they've treated their family worse than they had treated an enemy. So reconciliation really is not going to be possible at this point. It really is an extremely sad story. And although Israel technically wins this third battle, honestly, nobody really wins in a situation like this. The Lord is bringing civil war to an end, but this conflict has just gone from bad to worse to worse. It has continued to spiral out of control until the Lord ends it. And when we read these types of stories, we're so far removed from it, it's really easy for us to go, wow, how could they not figure this out? They didn't do what the Lord told them to do. But if we're really honest, don't we do the same thing? Don't we in our regular lives have situations that we let happen, and then we make it worse, and we make it worse again, and we let it spiral out of control when we really could have stopped it earlier? So when we look at stories like this, we can't really look at the Israelites and think, wow, we would be so much better than that, because we aren't. We take things into our own hands. We fail to seek the Lord like they did. We pile insult upon injury, and then the situation goes from bad to worse. So we read these stories, and we should think to ourselves, this is in the Bible, so what do we need to learn? If you've been studying with us all this time, you know that the book of Judges follows this horrible spiritual decline of the Israelites. They start doing what's right in their own eyes rather than what's right in the Lord's eyes. So as Israel takes this downward spiral in morals, they get farther and farther from the Lord. They have more and more conflict, right? It kind of goes hand in hand. We don't want to fall into the same trap as Israel, right? Are you guys still awake, right? We don't want to fall into the same trap as Israel, okay? This book really is a basic lesson in what not to do. We don't want to fall into that trap, so we want to remain close to the Lord, because Israel got farther from the Lord. We want to continue growing in our faith by studying His Word, by seeking Him, and following His guidance. So tonight we're going to go a little bit deeper into how to walk through conflict, doing things the way God wants us to do. So on the back of your handout, we've got 3 different things I think we can pull from the example of what the Israelites give us of what not to do. The first thing is doing the right thing can be really hard at the beginning, but it's much easier in the long run. Doing the right thing is hard up front, but easier in the long run. If you're going to be around people, conflict is unavoidable. Whether it's your family or your coworkers or people you don't know, because we're people and we have kind of minds of our own, there's going to be conflict. We naturally do not like to have conflict because we don't like to be in any situation that causes us a little bit of pain. And so we tend to initially avoid conflict. So if we come in a situation where there's going to be conflict, we try to avoid it. Now, admittedly, there are times when the conflict is not such a big deal. For instance, when my kids were in middle school, in the wintertime, for whatever reason, my boys thought it was a great idea to wear shorts. Now, I thought that was not a very wise choice, and I could have gotten into conflict with them every single morning about what they were wearing, but I kind of felt like it was a natural consequence. Fine, wear shorts, be cold, and I don't have to have that conflict with them. And eventually, both boys figured out that, yeah, Mom's probably right. That's not a great choice. So that was the conflict I chose for them to solve on their own. So there are some conflicts we just don't need to address. But there are other conflicts that if we let it go, it's going to be like Israel's problem. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Here's an example of that. And Pastor Pam and I have talked about this, so she knows I'm going to share this. When Pastor Pam first came, it wasn't long after that we were doing a Christmas program that was putting the adult choir and the kids choir together, and we've still continued to do that, so many of you are familiar with that. But it was the first time that she and I were really working together on a project, and we'd never done anything like this before. So it was a new project, we were newly working together, and there were tons of people involved. Now, you can imagine lots of people, lots of opinions, and 2 new pastors trying to figure it all out. And so there were several instances during practice where she was trying to do one thing and I was trying to do another thing, and it wasn't working out. And so we were kind of butting heads with that. And it got to a point where we were going to have to sit down and have a talk. And honestly, neither one of us really wanted to have that conversation, because we wanted to get along. And both of us were afraid that if we sat down and talked about it, it was going to be ugly. Have any of you ever been in a situation like that? Some of you are not telling the truth. So I called Pastor Pam and I said, hey, could we meet at church and talk? And she said, I don't think I want to. And I said, Pam, I don't really want to either, but I think we have to, because this is just going to get worse if we don't. So we came up to church on a Sunday evening, because we'd had practice that day and it had been awful. And we sat down and we talked, and then we cried, because we're girls. And then we talked some more, and it was so much better after that. And afterwards, I was so glad, and she was so glad, and we work really well together now. So that was the situation where if we'd not sat down and had that conversation, it would have just gotten worse. There would have just been more problems. So did either of us want to have the conversation? No. But it was good that we did, because that could have spiraled out of control. We had to keep working together. So we all have those kinds of situations that we have to work on at some point or another. So we naturally want to avoid that, but sometimes we do have to try to solve an issue at the lowest common denominator. If you know it's an issue that's going to keep coming back and it's just going to keep getting bigger and it's going to start involving more people, then you definitely have to take care of that. And I'd much rather deal with it when it's a little problem than before it gets to be a big problem. You need to be willing to also own your own part of that. There's always 2 sides to things. Sometimes we get into a problem and we think, well, it's all that person's problem. I'm sure that Israel was like, Benjamin did all of it. And Benjamin's like, Israel did all of it. There were things on both sides that they could have done differently, okay? So we have to be able to own our part of that. We have to be seeking truth. Matthew 6:33 says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. But what do we usually do? Do we seek first God? Usually we start seeking everybody else. What do you think? You know, so-and-so did this. What do you think she should have done? We start talking to our friends and gathering people around us to kind of help us decide what we should think. God's the first one we need to consult about those things, and that's really hard. But we have to be able to step back and seek him first. And then in John 8:31 through 32, so Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you, and catch the word abide, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Abide is a word that has kind of stuck with me this year. It's my word of the year. I've got it hanging on my wall because I want to remember that that's where I need to be. I need to be abiding in his word. When I'm living right there and I'm remembering his word, I'm less likely to go running off on one of my tangents and getting really upset about things that aren't really worth being upset about. But when I'm not abiding right there, then I'm off getting myself into trouble. That's when I'm Israel trying to go to battle. That's when I'm Benjamin trying to defend myself with things. So we need to be sure that we're abiding where he wants us to be. Now, when Kiana, my youngest daughter, was in middle school, Kiana had a teacher that had told me that she was struggling with reading. And if those of you who know me, I was a librarian. So, of course, that's a terrible thing for a librarian to have a kid that's struggling with reading. And what did I want to do? I wanted to help her, okay? But that year, the school district did not have enough textbooks for the students to have them to take home. And this was very frustrating for me because I could only help her at home. I worked, so I needed to have that book at home to help her. And I talked with the teacher on several occasions, and she just couldn't work with me to let me take this book home. And I got myself so worked up about this book because I've got a fourth grader who's crying because she can't get her homework done and doesn't understand, and I've got a teacher who can't help me. And I ended up, I'm so embarrassed about this, but I ended up in the principal's office frustrated and crying because I couldn't help my child with this book. Now, I'm not proud of that because there are so many better ways I could have handled that. I really should have gone back to the teacher and tried to work with her on a different time to work with Kiana, maybe before school or after school. But instead, I let myself get really worked up, and then I went to her boss and my boss and basically made a fool out of myself. That is not the way I want to handle myself in front of people. And it made me think of this Matthew 18 verse. So we have specific steps we should go to when we have difficulty with other people. Because basically I went in complaining about her before I'd really complained about it to her. So it tells us here, if your brother has sinned against you, go and tell him his fault. Now, I'd gone to her and said, I want to check out a book. And she'd said, I'm sorry, I can't. And that's all I'd said. I really should have gone back and said, I'm really, really frustrated about this. Can we talk about this some more? I didn't do that. So you talk about it between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell the church, and if he refuses to listen to even the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now, what I did is make an enemy out of that teacher because I went to her boss, and then her boss went to her, and it became a whole big thing. I let it spiral out of control. Now, I was able to go back to her later, and we hashed it out, and it got much better, but it could have been so much better from the very beginning. What we often do as humans is instead of going to the person we're having a problem with, we start going to everybody else. And unfortunately, what sometimes happens is we have partial information. Maybe you're out at a restaurant and you see someone that you know, and you see something happen and you think you have the whole story, but you don't. And then you go tell someone what you saw, but it was only part of it. And then that person tells somebody else, and that person tells somebody else. And what you know is only part of that story. And then it gets back to the person, and it's something completely different. Anybody ever played the game telephone? You know, where you say one thing and then you whisper it to the next person and it goes through 20 people and it's something completely different by the time it gets to the end. That happens a lot. And I have been in situations, not here, but in situations where you go into a group and someone says, I have a prayer request. And it's not really a prayer request, but it's a complaint about somebody that you want to pray for who has a problem, but they really just want to tell you about that person's problem. We have to be really, really careful as Christians that we don't use other people's problems against them as we're pretending to pray for them. That can be really, really painful for someone if it gets back to them and we're pretending to use that as a prayer request. And that can be done so easily without even realizing that we're doing that. It can just be so hurtful. And it again reminds me of what's happening with Israel and Benjamin, because they're hurting their brothers and they're exiling their brothers and they're not allowing for any type of reconciliation. How often do we hurt someone within the church and keep them from ever being able to walk back in our doors because of something frivolous that we didn't even realize that we said? So we want to be really, really careful of how we say things. So a second thing that I think we can see from this situation is that ignoring God's way always leaves us with a mess to clean up. So this really is a very, very messy story. When we look at everything that has happened in this situation, we've got a woman who was murdered. We have her husband who didn't protect her. We have brothers who have been torn apart. We have two different groups of people who are not listening to God. This whole thing that has just kind of spiraled out of control. We can see that they're both blaming each other, and they really have become blind to their own sin. And I think that's very easy for us to do as well. Sometimes we can very easily see what someone else is doing wrong, all the while we've got something going on with us. It's a little bit like letting the Canaanites do their thing right here in Israel while we're pointing our finger over here at Benjamin. And this brings up the verse from Matthew 7, 1 through 5. Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. I think that's a really sobering piece of scripture. I certainly don't want to be judging other people unfairly and then having that come back on me because I have not really been thinking about what's going on in my own life. So I want to be sober enough to be thinking about what is it that I'm doing? What am I blind to in my own life? If you look at the news at all, you can see how people are judging other people. And the news wants to keep us stirred up, right? So we need to be a little more focused on where we are with God and what we're doing. So it says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but you do not notice the log that was in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? And of course, the visual here is you're trying to take this teeny tiny speck out of your brother's eye, and there's this giant log in your own eye. Of course, you can't see anything. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So there's a few questions I want you to ask yourself, and I'm asking myself these too, because I think these are things we all struggle with, because we're human. Are you keeping a list of offenses? Do you walk in a place and think, oh, there's that person that hurt my feelings. There's that person that said that thing about me. Are you bringing others into the mess who don't need to be a part of the conversation? Are you, like Israel, gathering your troops around to go to battle? Are you focusing more on the problem than you are praying about the problem? This really hit me hard because I think sometimes I let my mind go around and around a problem. And if I'm not praying about it more than I'm thinking about it, I'm not doing what I should be doing. Are you ignoring counsel from the Word or godly people placed in your life? Are you using the phrase, yeah, but, because if we're trying to make excuses, we're doing the wrong thing. We need to be honest. We need to be honest with God. He knows anyway, right? We need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to be honest with others. If we've made a mess of something, it's really important for us to start working through that, because the thing is, it's going to keep coming up. If you don't work through it now, it's going to come up in another relationship or another situation. God will work through it with you, and He will help you heal, but you have to be able to do the work. And then the third thing is we need to approach conflict with reconciliation in mind. And this is hard, especially if someone has really deeply hurt you. Lance mentioned last week, he said the phrase, "Where is the grace?" And I think so often, because our world does not apply grace in many situations, that we get caught up in that too. But we need to, as Christians, as children of God, have grace for other people. And I'm trying to walk through life assuming the best. I might want to think the worst because I'm human, but I'm trying to assume the best. I might be wrong. I'd rather be wrong and assume the best than assume the worst. Retaliation ruins our chance for reconciliation. So I want to remove that word from my vocabulary. Sometimes we have to remember that we believe in the power of Christ's redemption. Sometimes when we get angry with someone and we want to retaliate, we want to think, well, they're just a terrible person and they can't ever fix that. Well, we believe in redemption. We believe in the power of Christ's redemption. So if I believe that, I have to believe that for everybody, not just the people that I like, not just the people who have been kind to me, but for everybody. For everybody. A Christ-like heart seeks the other person's well-being. Whether they're kind to me or not, whether I think I deserve it because I don't deserve God's grace. And if I get God's grace, so does that person. I'm not the one that gets to make that decision. God is. So there's 3 verses here from Romans. This whole chapter of chapter 12 of Romans, if this is something you struggle with, I encourage you to read this whole chapter. We are not meant to do this on our own because this is not natural. I don't naturally want to forgive people who have hurt me, but that's what God's grace is for. That's what God's power is for. That's why I have to abide in Him and stay connected to Him. I'm not meant to do this in my power. I'm meant to do this with His power. So Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Now, let me give you a little bit of geeky Greek for a minute. The word transformed doesn't mean one time. The word used there means repeatedly, over and over and over and over and over and over and over. You get the idea of that? We don't do that one time. We do that all the time. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I'm not meant to figure that out on my own. He is. He lets me know. Romans 12:17-18. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. You're going to run into people who don't accept your grace, who don't accept your kindness. You still have to give it because God gave it to you. That doesn't negate it. If they don't accept you, you're forgiving. That's helping you. Okay, forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you. And then Romans 12:21, do not overcome evil, overcome evil with good. I left one of the words out of that. As I said, none of this is easy. We are meant to walk through our day with God walking next to us. It's not about what we're doing, but who's walking with us. So I'd like to take just a couple minutes to pray, and I think that there are probably 3 things that we're looking at here. There may be some of you that are trying really hard to do the right thing at the beginning of a situation, and maybe you need to pray about what you need to do in that situation. And then there may be some of you who are looking at the end of a situation that you've made a mess of. We've all been there. And you really need God's help in cleaning that situation up. And then there may be some of you that are really trying to work on reconciliation. There's somebody that you'd like to see reconciliation with. And maybe that person isn't open to that, but again, that's more for your heart because you don't want to live in that place, whether they accept that or not. And so I'd like to invite you to spend a few moments in prayer. And you're welcome to come up to pray up here. If you would like someone to pray with you, I definitely would like you to come up here so we can pray with you. If you'd like to spread out a little bit, we're just going to take a few minutes while Khalees plays. And I would love to pray with some of you, especially if you're in the middle of a mess right now. I encourage you, if you're facing something, to take some of these verses and pray those verses over your life or over the person that you're praying with. I know conflict is hard. I know we all face it. But I know that God will walk through it with you in a mighty way if you let Him do that. Amen. So come forward if you'd like to come forward and pray, and we'll take just a few minutes.